Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Collaborative Science for Estuaries webinar series. This is Nick Soberal with the Science Collaborative. Today's webinar is the second entry in an ongoing series we're co-producing with NOAA's Restore Science program, which we're calling Collaborative Science Conversations. And Doug will say more about that in a moment, so I'll leave it to him to talk more about that. Last year's discussion, if you missed it, highlighted experiences and lessons learned on how to become effective co-producers of science. So if you missed it or you're just hearing about it for the first time, the summary resources from that session are going to be linked in the chat, and Megan will go ahead and drop that link in for everybody. So after I run through some quick housekeeping items, I'll invite our two moderators to set the stage for today's discussion. They'll introduce our speakers, who will give us a high-level overview of the work they've been doing related to today's topic, and then we'll move into the discussion portion where we'll encourage you to ask any questions you might have for our speakers. The way you can ask questions is by typing them into the questions feature in the GoToWebinar console. All attendees are muted upon entry, and we'll be handling questions this way. So you can either enter questions for the presenters as they occur to you throughout the webinar, or you can use it to alert us to any technical issues you might be having. Again, that's only visible to organizers, so any issues you have, just send them to us and questions. So with that, I'd like to introduce our moderators for today's session and then turn it over to them to lead the session. So Caitlin Young is the science coordinator for the NOAA Restore Science program. She leads the science program's efforts to synthesize environmental and human dimensions research data available for the Gulf of Mexico to design funding competitions. She has a background in geochemistry and has researched the impacts of submarine groundwater discharge on coastal ecosystems. And a familiar face for the Collaborative Science for Estuaries webinar series, Doug George is a geological oceanographer and the program manager for the NERRS Science Collaborative. He has worked throughout the West Coast as a federal scientist, state resource manager, and environmental consultant with projects ranging from estuary restoration and living shorelines to regional sediment management and climate change adaptation. And with that, I will pass it to our moderators.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Caitlin Young, and I'm with the NOAA Restore Science program. I'm going to give you a little overview of our program. The NOAA Restore Science program is investing Clean Water Act penalty money from the Deepwater Horizon oil spill to learn more about the Gulf of Mexico's living coastal and marine resources and connect this knowledge with their management. By exploring the connections between different parts of the Gulf of Mexico ecosystem and prioritizing science that applies to natural resource management decisions, the science program is supporting the sustainability of the Gulf and its coastal communities. The science program has a lot of activities going on. One of those is a series of workshops that we're running across the Gulf of Mexico to bring natural resource managers and researchers together to learn how to produce the science needed to reduce uncertainty around natural resource management decisions. And this practice, which is also known as co-production, can lead to research findings and products that align with the decisions that the resource managers have to face. In 2020, the science program ran a competition to support the planning for actionable science. That competition supported 20 teams of researchers, managers, and stakeholders to collaborate in an iterative manner to scope and design a research project to inform natural resource management decision. In a couple minutes, you're going to hear from one of our science program funded teams that we awarded in 2021. And those planning projects are wrapping up now, and the science program is currently running a follow-on competition to support the research and application of actionable science. That competition is going to close on November 30th, and it's going to support researcher, resource manager, and stakeholder partnerships to execute a previously planned collaborative research project. And finally, I would be remiss if I didn't say that just yesterday, the science program launched its Gulf Ecosystem Initiative, which is a partnership with the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. And that's designed to convene scientific working groups consisting of government agencies, NGOs, researchers, and other stakeholders to inform resource management, including restoration. So with that, I'm gonna pass to Doug George, my counterpart here today.
Great, thank you, Caitlin. Welcome everybody to our program today. As Nick said, I'm Doug George. I'm the program manager for the NERRS Science Collaborative. And also want to thank you, Nick, for all the great, amazing production you do behind the scenes, as well as Hannah from the Restore program. So we couldn't get these things done without a lot of people behind the scenes helping us out. So thank you for your assistance. I'm going to take a step back and also introduce the NERRS, the National Estuarine Research Reserve System, or NERRS for short. 50 years ago, this month, the Coastal Zone Management Act was signed into law by President Nixon and established the NERRS. And the NERRS is a national network of 30 unique research reserves, and we are celebrating this year by welcoming Connecticut as our 30th. That happened in January. Today, we have over 1.3 million acres that are protected in almost every coastal state, and we continue to grow both in the Gulf and along the Great Lakes region. So this is a NOAA program that works in collaboration with local place-based partners, either a state agency or university, or in one case, a nonprofit. And each research site includes programs focused on land stewardship, research and scientific monitoring, training programs for the public and local officials, and education. So that's the NERRS, and the Science Collaborative supports science for estuarine and coastal decision-making by coordinating regular funding opportunities that we have one open as well right now. So Caitlin is highlighting one of hers, the Restore program. We have one as well that is open, and you can get more information about that on our website, which we have links that are flowing into the chat, so please check them out. The Science Collaborative is managed by the University of Michigan's Water Center through a cooperative agreement with NOAA. And similar to how Caitlin was describing what kind of research we support, it's highly collaborative, and it's about integrating users into the research process to create products that support coastal management. So one of the tools that I want to highlight that we recently developed is the Guide to Collaborative Science, which I think we'll get also in the chat. And that gives you a lot of information on how to begin the process, how to manage the process, and then how to conclude the process, setting yourself up for the next phase of collaborative research. So our webinar series often focuses on collaborative science projects and what they have achieved towards the end of a project. Teams usually have lots of great science and tools they want to share, and also how they got there. But today's webinar, we're really excited to continue our partnership with NOAA's Restore program as the second installment of what we're calling the Collaborative Science Conversations. As Nick mentioned a few minutes ago, last year's discussion highlighted experiences and lessons learned on how to become effective co-producers of science. And if you missed that webinar or just hearing about it for the first time, please check out our YouTube channel where you can see that. I think that another link. We're going to be overlinked. There are other NOAA programs such as the National Marine Sanctuaries and Ocean Observing Systems that are also growing their collaborative science expertise. So stay tuned as we expand our partnerships for this series. Next year, for example, we're going to be coming back together with Restore, or Restore's going to come back with us, however you want to look at it, to hear more about what the development of a collaborative science project entails and what the co-production process means for science and the products. But Caitlin, I have a question for you. What are we going to be talking about today with our guests?
So the idea for this webinar was really to directly address how collaborative science can assist project teams in producing actionable science in a challenging political landscape. We know these can be really tough landscapes to do this type of work in. And we also know that ecosystems cross all of these political boundaries, and they don't really care about our human-made issues. So research projects that span political boundaries can be tricky because these decisions are often made on long timelines. There's changes in policy and staff along the way frequently, and that can set back your timeline. And it can really be difficult to effectively engage diverse stakeholders so that their perspectives inform the work throughout the lifespan of the project, and that they feel like that project is something that they provided input to when the final decisions are made. So in these complex situations with competing interests, there's a much higher likelihood that the science that's being produced is going to be applied when the problems are tackled with a collaborative science framework. So thanks so much, Doug, for linking in that guide to collaborative science that the NERRS has produced. It's really a fantastic resource for anyone interested in collaborative science. And today we're going to be hearing from two different project teams, and they're going to discuss how they worked across political boundaries and utilize collaborative science to produce action plans that are going to work to improve ecosystem management in their respective areas. So I believe we're going to hand it over to our panelists now. First up, I'm going to allow our Restore team funded project to introduce themselves. And that's Dr. Soupy Dalyander and George Ramseur. And their project was a structured decision-making to co-produce an actionable science plan in support of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama coastal systems water quality management. Soupy and George, go ahead and introduce yourselves, please.
So I am Soupy Dalyander. I'm a research scientist with the Water Institute of the Gulf. My background is in oceanography as well as in structured decision making as a way to co-produce as well as bring science and decision making. George, did you want to introduce yourself and then I can kind of jump into the slides?
Sure. George Ramseur. I'm my educational background is geology and anthropology, and more of the anthropology has come into play lately, it seems, with the political things. But I'm fresh off of 16 years as the Director of Restoration and Resiliency at the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, and just moved over here to Moffitt and Nickel in the consulting sector at the end of August this year. So adapting to a lot of new things here. But one of my key set-asides to come and work in the private sector was to be able to keep working with this effort. So pleased to be here.
Caitlin, would you like to go ahead and jump right into our project?
Yeah, please go ahead and intro your project for the audience.
Sure. So as was mentioned, this work has been supported through the NOAA Restore program, so thank you. And for the context of this, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama coastal system, or LMACS, is an estuarine system that crosses 3 state boundaries and also touches a lot of the federal community in terms of regulatory authorities. And really what the driver behind this is that water quality has changed quite a bit over the last few decades. That specifically led to a loss of oyster habitat in Mississippi state waters, which is a particular interest to Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, MDMR. And in fact, there hasn't been an oyster harvest over the last couple of years. And so we started this planning process as a way to bring together the interagency decision makers, again, recognizing that water quality doesn't recognize water doesn't recognize state boundaries, so neither can we, as well as that cross section of regulatory authorities. Because ultimately, there may be actions that could be taken in one state that would improve water quality across state lines, which obviously have some complicating factors. So if you go to the next slide, please. I'll go ahead and start talking about while that's changing. So you saw the various logos on the first slide, but essentially this kind of provides a little diagram of our overall process. We're under that planning grant, we've brought together representatives from the resource management and regulatory agencies that go on the bottom there. So in addition to representation across the three states, National Park Service, which owns Gulf Island or manages Gulf Islands, National Seashore, which is in play here, Army Corps of Engineers, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, which in addition to regulatory authorities, manages the Breton National Wildlife Refuge, which includes the Chandeleur Islands. So we brought together representatives from those entities along with researchers and myself from Water Institute as facilitators for co-production to identify what some of the critical uncertainties are as far as managing water quality and developing a research and application plan for resolving those critical uncertainties and then bringing them into action. And so what came out of those workshops was the design of a decision support and model framework. We really got into the weeds of what are the criteria that the resource managers need to see to have that designed, as well as on the research side, what do you need to be robust? Design the development of an interagency resource management working group, because at least for this project, the co-production wouldn't be able to stop at just the planning. We would need to have continued integration across not only with MDMR, but with the other agencies. And then developing a framework that would be able to investigate some critical or some scenarios of potential management for water quality. The other thing I'll mention is that we've expanded this to include a plan for engaging oyster fishers specifically as stakeholders to be involved in this. And so our plan, our plan is to implement our plans. So we're pursuing funding to be able to put this into practice.
Thanks, Soupy. I'm going to hand it back to Doug now to introduce our other panelists.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you, Soupy and George. Welcome to our series and our conversation. So yeah, I'm really excited to present or to introduce our neuroscience collaborative project, which Stuart Siegel and Aimee Good might be familiar faces to the Science Collaborative series. But for those of you who out there who do not know Stuart and Aimee, Stuart, would you like to just introduce yourself and your role, and then Aimee, you can go next, and then whoever would like to talk about your project, about this pesky road situation.
Great, thanks so much, Doug. I'm Stuart Siegel. I'm the interim manager of the San Francisco Bay National Estuary Research Reserve, and that's Doug gave a nice overview before about the system as a whole. Our reserve in San Francisco Bay consists of 2 reserve sites, China Camp State Park, which we'll be talking about today, and sort of north central San Francisco Bay, and then a second place called Rush Ranch up sort of northeastern part of San Francisco Bay. I've got a very long background doing collaborative science, going back to undergraduate days where I dove into this quite a few years ago, and then have worked with the state of California and local and federal interests for many, many years throughout San Francisco Bay. So I've had a lot of fun trying to tackle the cross-boundary collaborative science, all sort of driving ecosystem planning and climate change preparedness for the San Francisco Bay. Aimee?
And I'm Aimee Good. I'm the Coastal Training Program Coordinator for the SF Bay NERR, and I've been collaborative lead on the project that we're going to be talking about today at China Camp State Park. So working with Stuart and a really broad suite of stakeholders sort of tackling this road project, looking at adaptation possibilities, but also working with the other 2 California reserves to look at similar issues that they're having, tackling very complex political situations with roads bisecting critical natural habitat. So we're sort of looking at this locally, but also looking at it statewide.
Okay. I'll jump in and give a very brief introduction to our project. So what we are dealing with here, if you look at the map, there's China Camp State Park in the middle. You can see kind of ringing the park is a dark line, which is the road that runs around this about 1,000-foot tall ridge that extends out to San Francisco Bay, and it connects central northern Santa Fe through a single road around this whole peninsula that goes through the park. And there are sections of this road that were built 125, 130 years ago that go through the middle of the tidal marsh. And not surprisingly, they flood during king tides in the winter and during winter storms. And so we've been looking at sort of a community co-design process of how to tackle the flooding of these roads and the impairment they cause to the marshlands. And as Aimee mentioned, this kind of fits in with a statewide effort that she's working on. And then I think probably most of us anywhere lives on the coast can think of a place where you have a road that goes right by the shoreline and goes underwater sometimes, and actually plays a pretty important transportation network function in some fashion in those communities. This road has, in addition to really impairing the ecological functions of the marsh, is a really critical transportation network. It is that loop around that peninsula. There's communities on both sides that use that for commuting. It is the only way to get into the park, and the park is used very heavily every year. But it's about 400,000 visitors annually to this park. And it's education, it's recreation, it's research, active tribal uses out here. The fire and police use it for emergency response, both within the park and also in the neighborhoods either side. And then also when there are major problems, it's an evacuation route for communities around this peninsula. It's complicated because it's a state park owns the park, the county owns the road, it's a research reserve. to do anything. This is ultimately a project-oriented project to bring a solution on board here. So any of you who ever tried to do projects know the suite of state and federal permits you have to get. And one of the things we're trying to do here is in the scheme of things, there's complexities here, but this is also ideally a bit bite-sized. And so we're trying to do a project, how can you make this work when you have a somewhat bite-sized suite of issues? Next slide, please. So just to give a sort of a spatial context, that this part of the San Francisco Bay is a really interesting topography of hills and valleys. Every valley used to be tidal marshland and is now a city and developed. And so China Camp State Park, shown in the foreground here, is one of a very few places left in the entire San Francisco Bay where you have intact natural ecosystems that go from the bay through the tidal marshes, up into some wet meadows, and up into the grasslands and woodlands of the hills there. You can see the development off to the left in that picture, which is one of the neighborhoods, and then off to the right is cut off is the other neighborhood that really uses park on a regular basis. So it crosses all these different jurisdictions. The way the road goes is it's city and county in terms of political jurisdictions there, but with the state and the federal programs there, it really weighs in quite a bit. So the last slide, please, gets us into, maybe Aimee can talk about last slide, is sort of what we call our community of interest. If you want to kind of cover this, Aimee, that'd be great.
Sure, yeah, so we used a bottom-up stakeholder approach from the inception of this project, and we've sort of worked our way through a whole suite of science collaborative projects, but making sure that we're bringing in all interested parties to help set our goals and objectives, and that involves regulators, landowners, recreational users, you know, all the different entities. The local county supervisor is our convener. We have the park operator, we have the local tribes. And so we've been trying to be very inclusive and transparent from the get-go in our planning processes to make sure that all interests are voiced and heard and shared. And we're now sort of in the third phase of this work. So I think that's sort of the initial overview. And I think then also some of the questions that come up will help. I'm happy to elaborate.
Thank you, Aimee.
All right, well, thank you all of you for describing your projects. And Caitlin and I are gonna have a little conversation with you both, with all four of you. So I'm gonna kick us off and ask a question for anyone to take first. And these are two very different projects, two very different geographies, of course, very different levels of players. But across both projects, how did you know that a collaborative science approach was right for working across these various jurisdictions and boundaries in your two respective scales and project areas? Stuart, you're muted if you're talking.
There we go. Much better when you're not on mute. So I'll take a stab on our project. It came from two different places. One is that it was kind of obvious, I guess, a certain way. So we started here in 2017 with a capacity building grant from the Science Collaborative to really begin bringing the community together and start talking about what the questions, and that, you know, within literally a one-day session, made it very apparent of the need to do collaborative science here and to really engage our broad suite of community interests. That jumped out from literally the very beginning of this whole process. We also know that we have very sensitive natural resources, lots of endangered species there. And so literally anything you do, you have to tread very carefully. State Parks, who owns the park, is very cautious with any changes, even if they're for the better, how you do them in a way that's protective of the natural resources out there. We also knew very strongly about the different kinds of uses of the park out there for a lot of different interests, not least of which is the tribal cultural practices, as well as archaeological resources of the tribe that could be underground where we might need to be doing work. How, as I described, how the road gets used by the community just tells you all these different competing interests, and linking across both city and county jurisdictions, really, all that together made it kind of a pretty obvious path we needed to follow for this project.
Soupy or George?
Well, I'll take this one on our behalf. I would say the main driver was failure early on. Going back probably 8 years ago, I was engaged in more resource management heavy than science or research heavy activities. We've just gotten a pretty good beneficial use of dredge material program going in Mississippi. And then it came to our attention that the Port of Gulfport was entertaining dredging about 10 million cubic yards of material, or enough to fill a couple of superdomes. And one of the things you may have noticed about Mississippi on the map is it doesn't have a whole lot of coastline. So even though we lose a couple hundred acres of marshes and barrier islands every year, we didn't have a place to put 10 million cubic yards of material all at once. Partially, doing a large project is difficult because our entire estuary in Mississippi is defined as Gulf sturgeon critical habitat. At the same time, there's a very large marsh complex that forms part of the barrier with the Gulf that the barrier islands are typically the centerpiece of that affect the regulation of marine water into the estuary. And as Soupy was talking about, that affects water quality, principally salinity, which is the main issue for oysters, in Mississippi at this point. Any rate, so we came up with a solution to a lot of things we thought, which was to gain a permit for a 800-acre marsh restoration site in Biloxi Marsh. Now, Biloxi is a Mississippi town, but Biloxi Marsh is in Louisiana. So it would involve taking this 10 million yards from the Port of Gulfport in Mississippi to Biloxi Marsh in Louisiana. And possibly coming up from an agency standpoint, I think I had some faith that the standard federal and state permitting, notice of intents and all that sort of thing would be adequate to get everybody involved. And what we learned pretty quickly was there were folks in Mississippi that weren't going to give any of their material to Louisiana, even though restoration in this area would have some of the highest possible value for Mississippi. The fact that they'd taken similar amounts of material into the ocean and giving it to federal waters didn't seem to sway the argument anyway. So that train of thought is still alive in Mississippi as far as a particular project like this, taking material across the line. But if we start looking at this as a system, and I think as Caitlin said, without the silly human constructs in a way, I guess I embellished that a little bit, but we've got to figure out a way to at least conduct basic regional sediment management practices and things like that, so we can match sources with needs and put all of the effort, material and economic, into projects that give maximum benefit for the system. So decided that the next time we tried something like this, it would be with all the regulatory agencies, the scientific community, everybody working it up from the bottom, getting it completely integrated, and then start moving into a permitting process. And that's what we call feasibility, what we term feasibility in this original project. It's not only got to make sense scientifically and practically and economically, but it's got to make sense politically. So that's it.
Thanks, George. Yeah, that feasibility piece is key. So I'm going to take the next question that we have for y'all, and that is, what do you think that the key steps in developing a collaborative science project were? And maybe you could talk a bit about how you've handled working with partners who might have competing interests or perspectives.
So I can kind of jump in on that for LMACS, the LMACS project. So what we found is leaning into decision science and decision analysis and specifically structured decision making, which is SDM is an objectives-oriented approach that essentially walks you through, what are the issues, what are the objectives, what are alternatives? Okay, now I know what we might do. Let's leverage science and research and modeling to be able to predict what the outcomes are, to then think about trade-offs. And for that, having that structure has been really key as far as moving things forward with having so many states and the federal agencies in play, because what we could do is really transparently identify what the objectives were, which may be in conflict with each other, right? Maybe that what one person's most important thing, you think about regulating water quality, and there's aspects of restoring the barrier islands, there's aspects of controlling freshwater inflows, et cetera. That water quality isn't the only concern in the field. So by doing it in that structured way through SDM, we could identify those objectives. Everyone could see where their concerns were on the board. There wasn't anything hidden. And then as we are moving through that process, looking forward to when we execute this, we are, and this is exactly why our resource manager group has to, continue to be so heavily involved and so closely involved, is that, as we're finalizing what the alternatives will run. So, like what George was saying, sediment placement in Biloxi Marsh or in other places, or thinking about those freshwater inflows, really getting at that decision that MDMR in conjunction with other state and federal agencies need to make about what to do and how to prioritize what they're doing. We can actually have those conversations and then use the science and use the research to kind of do those what if scenarios. And at the same time, what we bring along is a lot of understanding research that answers some key uncertainties about the system itself. So the science gets to come along for the ride, in terms of answering things like, all right, what are the relative importance of things like the integrity of the barrier islands versus different freshwater inflows, that are science questions in their own right and research questions, but that are absolutely critical in terms of informing that decision making. So yeah, for us, really having that structured process, which for us we leveraged SDM, is really what's enabled us to work across boundaries and work interdisciplinary and across research and kind of the political and management realm, because again, everything's just sort of on the table and everything's very systematic.
And I can jump in and follow up on that. And to echo everything Soupy said, definitely the structured decision-making piece, right? And having a roadmap for where you're starting and where you're heading, and bringing people in along the way and bringing them with you. And I think a key piece is not to jump ahead to solutions too fast, right? A lot of times with these projects, we all have the idea of what makes sense and what's the logical outcome, but not going there before you bring your audience with you, right? Bringing them in, bringing their interests in, and making sure that you're never going to make everyone happy, but trying to help set goals and objectives that everyone can see their piece in. So that way they are bought into the process, and be like, again, just to restate, being really transparent with that process. And when you hit road bumps, kind of pausing and reevaluating. And also, I think that's one thing that NERR likes to bring, is trying to play the neutral party. And also, because that is a reserve site, we aren't always exactly neutral, knowing when to bring in a neutral facilitator or mediator as well, when you know that there's a contentious piece that could derail your progress. So being ready to adapt your timeline to potential road bumps, and knowing when you need to hit pause and really sort of reframe and get people back together before moving on to the next steps.
That's almost like a perfect lead-in, Aimee, to a question that I have. And Soupy, you both fed a lot of great information into this one. This is to Aimee and Stuart about San Francisco, about the San Francisco Bay project, and what you were just saying right there, Aimee, about reframing, taking a pause. So those are really important relationship management tools. So my question is, how aware were you of some of the constraints that your team members were under. And as you were going through the project, did you gain more understanding about them? And how did that sort of, to expand a little bit on that, setting objectives and goals at the beginning, but how did those things maybe change? So Aimee and Stuart, if you could start with that one.
Sure. That's an interesting question. So at sort of a higher level, I think the awareness was really solid there to begin with, because we've done things like this at other places, so you kind of have a general sense of the issues that come up. So you sort of at a high level, we're going to have, we know we have sensitive natural resources that triggers a bunch of issues. We know we have conservation groups that pay a lot of attention to that kind of thing. We know the place is important to the tribe and to the community. So we have sort of at the high level, and a lot of this, when, as I mentioned in 2017, we did this initial community workshop just to kind of get everybody to come to the table and start the conversation. And that was a good way to sort of validate some of these sort of high level things you can kind of bring in from experience, and then really start seeing how they pertain more exactly to this place precisely. And then when we did, we were on our third round of Science Collaborative, kind of working through the process, and part two was called a Catalyst Grant. And that was really, as Aimee mentioned, is really getting people to sit down and start thinking through goals and objectives, mapping out where everybody wants to see the outcome be before we go into defining solutions. And that actually presented a lot of constraints. And it was interesting from across the board, is that people get different ways of thinking about where they're trying to go. And some people wanted things big in general. We want to save the world. Well, that's kind of hard to work with. We want to make sure this road continues to provide support for the community in terms of a transportation network piece. And so getting from these big, broad generalities to very concrete goals, that took some effort, because some people push back against that and want to keep the text on the slide nice and short, but doesn't communicate enough necessarily. And we had to, as I mentioned, we had to pause, and including with our state parks partner, who was like, wait a minute, we're not sure what's going on here. And just, take those time to pause with folks and really make sure that what the needs they had and their interests, that they understood what was being put on the table here, and that they really saw they had a voice in how things were being shaped. And then, again, the structured decision-making process, it uncovers all kinds of things there, right? It was just, because we use this process to let everybody brainstorm what they thought ideas might be. And then from all that, through a process of filtering through assessment criteria, kind of picking the ones that seem to have some merit. And that really kind of showed some of these key constraints that the community had that might be very different from the parks and the county and this kind of thing. So really the process let these things emerge, and they still are emerging. I think it was a George or Soupy mentioned that people change. The longer things take, the more staff change, and you start over with people. And sometimes you have people that are ready to jump right in and collaborate and help, and others are like, that's not how I do things. I'm going to push things differently. And so you have to stop and assess how to deal with those folks. Aimee, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say there's sort of the known hurdles that we knew we had to jump over, and then of course there's all the new ones, and exactly that staff turnover, elections. Our convener is now moving up to a different position. Just constantly being able to try to be nimble and adjust, and it's all about relationship building. And then when you have your sort of key players changing, you gotta be ready to bounce back and build those relationships new with the new players that have the decision-making powers.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that those are some really key points. I'm going to just pause and remind the audience that our chat box is open. We really welcome any questions that you have for our panelists today, and happy to kind of add those to the questions that Doug and I have prepared in advance. This question is for George and Soupy, and so I know you both are you know, working in this Gulf of Mexico landscape. George, you have a lot of experience and familiarity with the Mississippi management system, and Soupy, I know you're based in Louisiana, but also have some experience across state lines here. So can you talk about your experience, like working to build trust across states, and kind of how you got through some of those historical political boundaries that exist here in the Gulf, and how you managed expectations in doing that process?
Well, I'll jump in on this. I think pretty much this effort we're involved in right now, to me, is the first time that this has really been done properly. I mean, appreciated Aimee's comment about, you know, you think you're doing the right thing, so everybody will see that and it'll be all right. And just to be clear, we got a permit for that 800-acre site in Biloxi Marsh, but there were political underpinnings running outside of the whole formal process that, you know, just ultimately turned it into a no-go. But on the other hand, I certainly had a lot of experience thinking about what's going on in the other states through the Gulf of Mexico Alliance, which I've been engaged with since about 2007. And that's really where the BU idea and nexus of the program came from. We bundled people up in vans and took them to Louisiana and Texas, and saw huge 3,000-acre projects on the Sabine. And maybe the problem is you get over assimilated to that kind of thing. So you go, well, we just want to do 800 acres. But a real problem in Louisiana on Biloxi Marsh was essentially extraordinary amounts of distrust. Nobody could believe that Mississippi would give up $300 million worth of dirt unless something was wrong with it. And then, of course, Mississippi was like, well, we're not giving that to anybody. We'll throw it away. We'll show you. So I don't know if that helps answer this question or not, but it's I think when we started this, I was bugging Soupy constantly to make sure that I wasn't running ahead of things and blowing up the SDM process, because I was like, oh, personally, I tried to get 3 or 4 different grants before it would kick us down this road. And this is the first thing, Dave, Caitlin, and NOAA Restore Science and everything, this is the first time somebody saw us and saw the potential here. Soupy, I'll let you say something.
Well, I mean, and this is actually something that SDM, you know, I think helped with, and I mean, one thing the team has, you know, always tried to do is be realistic about the things that a lot of times in science don't get talked about, like everything that George is saying, like the concerns, you know, the public concerns and across state boundaries, you know, things that, like, you know, sometimes are like, well, I don't want to worry about that. That's messy and ugly, and I don't want to think about it. You know, we've really taken a lot of steps to make sure that, you know, we're honest with ourselves about what's there. So, I mean, you know, even in thinking about the base of the decision framework that, you know, that we've included in the plans is a numerical model. And I mean, you know, the Water Institute of the Gulf, you know, we do a lot of hydrodynamic modeling, but, you know, a frank conversation that we had was that if we were to do it, there was concerns that, you know, because we are Louisiana based, that there wouldn't be, you know, confidence or trust in it, you know, regardless, you know, not just, you know, appearance. So, you know, that's one of the things that we've done, you know, as far as the plan moving forward, is that, you know, we brought on USGS, Divina Preseri from the USGS Coastal and Marine, because USGS is a federal entity. You know, they also have the capacity to do numerical modeling. They've worked a lot in the Gulf, that group. You know, they're solid, and it's unquestionable, right? They're a, you know, federal entity. They do not have any specific state ties. So, you know, and those are hard conversations to have, because all of us that are researchers, we want to be the ones to run the model, right? We want to be the ones to run our toys. You know, so they're hard conversations, you know, sometimes, but, you know, I think that's been, you know, critical, you know, and I think we've kind of coalesced around it, you know, and I think that's also kind of helped with, you know, as George said, he's left NDMR now, but we've now, you know, gained 3 others actually from NDMR who are now on our team, you know, which is great. you know, and I think having, you know, again, being, you know, just always coming back to what is it that we need to do, you know, and the objectives, you know, I'm thinking about, you know, even when it comes to those sort of conversations, you know, I think that has also helped us in that transition because, like, you know, Stuart and Aimee were saying, you know, you still have to go back and you know, build up those interpersonal relationships, but you know, if you have something to point to, they can say, this is what we're doing and why. It makes it a lot easier, you know, when it transitions. So.
I just want to say one more thing. That what Soupy is talking about was a hugely altruistic move for a big organization like the Water Institute.
Yeah, I want the best for the project, but yeah, it's still still tough to talk about, right?
I appreciate that. Thank you, Soupy and George, for expanding on that. I'm going to turn to our audience and offer again our Q&A box. This is your chance to get advice from some very practiced folks, both in the Gulf and in the West Coast here. But it doesn't matter if you're working in some other place or working across some other different levels of jurisdictions or state lines. We'd love to hear some of your questions. So while you're still constructing those, I want to kind of tee off with something that all of you have kind of said, which is around sort of what do you do when there's a staff transition, and kind of expand that a little bit more for a next project. So what kind of practices have you learned from your respective projects that you plan to apply coming up? So Aimee, I think you have some ideas around that space that you might want to share, but I'd encourage Soupy and George as well to kind of weigh in on this. But Aimee, do you have something you want to share on that space? What practices?
Yes, really articulating your plans, right? And I'm going to keep saying the goals and objectives, but also memorandums of understanding or of agreement, charters, having the group, once you get your identified group together, so you don't lose traction if there is staff turnover or, different things that happen, having things well articulated so that the new person can come in and very quickly get up to speed, and also have something concrete to work with to understand what their role is, what the prior person's role is, but also what their entity's role is in the project and how they fit into that. So I think that's really a key piece of any successful process.
I would say the thing I would add is recognize to take the time to do some education. So as the new staff come on from different organizations, is have those items that Aimee was just talking about, but to be willing to kind of step back, sit down with them maybe one-on-one if that's what's needed, or a small group setting, and go over what you're doing and just let them ask questions. And really, at each person's individual speed is let them, in some ways, you want to make sure they know what's going on, and so they're the ones who have the questions and their own personal levels of understanding and the history they bring into it, and just give them a little bit of that time to do that, and create that opportunity for them to feel like they're being brought in and part of the project, and they're having their own perspectives able to be brought to the table. I've done this I've had projects that went on 10 or 20 years, and by the end you're 100% staff turnover everywhere. And you've done this probably 2 or 3 or 4 times along the way. I'm sure others might have had that in varying degrees of things they've worked on.
Yeah, well, it's funny you say that, Stuart. I was just going to ask about these timelines, and I was just thinking, we have this question about, but collaborative science typically is thought that it takes longer to produce, and how did you think it impacted your timelines? And I was thinking about kind of George's intro saying how this project started many years ago and kind of completely fell apart. And so maybe it's that whole process in and of itself takes a long time. And so you're kind of restarting with the collaborative framework. So maybe you guys could just talk a bit about these timelines and kind of how you deal with the longer timelines of collaborative science, and maybe the pros and cons of those types of that stretching out of the process. Soupy, I think you were going to jump in before I spoke there.
Yeah, and actually it ties to that. I mean, I think one thing is, and this, what, Stuart said, even when you have the same team, being, realistic about what the timelines are, and that it will take some time, and to, take some steps to kind of right size the approach to it. So, and I think, all of us on here that work with SDM have like run into these types of issues that, I mean, the level of, research you can bring to bear on that could be very complicated and could be multi-year, or it could be, fairly straightforward and fairly simple and targeted. So I think, a lot of it has to do with, prep on the front end, and making sure that your process is kind of aligned, even knowing that it will take a little bit longer, communicating that with the decision maker. The other thing that we found, on this project, and I found on other projects, is, a lot of times, if you're in a decision maker resource management role, you have to be focused on the problem right in front of you. Like, you have to put out the fire that's right in front of you, but it may be part of a larger, more programmatic, issue. And so, it may be, and that's one of the things that we found with the LMACS, is that, you can set it up where you're helping stay on a timeline to help, some particular focused decisions, inform one particular project, for example, that might go on the landscape, but that it could be that there's a decision-making process that's a little higher level and more programmatic. So these larger scale decisions on, on the management of water quality, they're not going anywhere, they're not going away, so we, being able to adapt it so that you can get some core information early, while also supporting, something that's a little bit longer term, and that's a little bit more, essentially, like, gives more opportunity for iteration, because you can really kind of inform that programmatic decision making. I think, that helps a lot too, but basically right sizing.
Yeah, and I think that's really great, Soupy, and I'll push for this context that you can put the time in now, or you put the time in later, right? And so the more you invest in the collaborative science approach up front, with the hopeful outcome that your constituencies are brought along and involved, know what's going on, then ideally you have less time at the other end, which is to get something to happen, and certainly in California, I think this is probably pretty common, I mean, in places, is if people don't like what you're trying to do, there's a lot of tools to put barriers in your way at the tail end of a project. And so the more people are brought on board early, that your trade-off is a little more time invested up front, although maybe not a lot more, and a lot less time at the tail end, and actually getting something done on the ground. And so that whatever it is problem is trying to be addressed, you actually reach the place of a solution happening, be it a plan or a policy or a project, whatever the case may be. And so I always want to make sure that we don't come across as being, well, this is very time consuming, therefore we're not going to bother with it. It's like, this is probably a time saver in the scheme of things, and just remember that time goes in somewhere along the way in most cases.
Yeah, Stuart, I want to hop in because I want to totally build off that one. We got a great question from the audience that I wanted to ask, which feeds off that, which is, do you have advice for a case where working groups have a few members who aren't interested in compromising their own goals? So you're just talking about time, putting time in, but what if you have some sort of intrinsic sort of folks that aren't interested in compromising? Any of you can answer that question.
I mean, that's tricky, right? So, and I think sometimes there's entities that just want to be obstinate just to be obstinate, not necessarily making an informed decision. Yeah, I don't know that I have a clear answer for that. I think it's very process and project specific. But I think, again, understanding where they're coming from and what the background is, what they hope to gain from creating the roadblock. And like Stuart said, trying to educate, right? What the hope and outcomes, and how that could be beneficial to everyone, even if they can't see that initially.
I think what Aimee mentioned, this idea of a charter, so the science collaborative, for example, does suggest that where it makes sense, you establish a charter for your working group. And it kind of lays out process, how things get done, and especially decision making. And we've talked about structured decision making here. And sometimes you get lucky and you reach complete consensus, right? And more often, I would say you probably never quite get to that level. And so it's really defining up front how you make decisions. And I'm involved in something else where they have a charter and they have a very prescribed that, that if 3 people object, then they need more conversation. If 2 object, then it goes through with caution. If 1 object, it's kind of noted, sort of a way to handle different perspectives of people not wanting to agree to things. But having that up front so that when these things do arrive, you can point back to, we anticipated this could happen. Here's how we're going to deal with the situations when they do occur. And you will have unhappy people along the way somewhere and they may be putting barriers up because they just choose to, or because there's something that's so fundamental to them that they just can't move beyond it. And it may be, if that's a minority position, that whatever the project is, that's where you get into the permit process and that kind of stuff, is that they have to balance in a way, and the agencies make those decisions on behalf of everybody. So the charter, I think, is a really useful tool to at least put a groundwork for how to tackle those situations when they come up.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks to Megan. She put a link to the part of the guide that includes information about charters and how to develop them in the chat. So that's also a really great resource.
Yes, thank you, Megan. We did get one more question from the audience. We'd love to hit it in our last couple of minutes here. So this question is about, how do you navigate different expectations of folks coming from the quote unquote bottom versus the folks coming from the top? So kind of like the people who are stakeholders that maybe don't have any decision-making power versus the folks at the top who do have that power. And is there a time to bring these 2 groups together, or is there a need to translate between these 2 groups?
So I'm going to take a first cut at this. I think the first thing is being very clear, and deliberate in who is a decision maker versus a stakeholder, because sometimes people don't want to put the work in on the front end to think about that and think about where, because nothing's going to frustrate someone more than thinking you're asking for their input and that's going to influence in something, and you were actually just thinking of getting information, or telling them what's happening. So I think being, very clear about, what the decision is, who the entities are that have decision-making authority that is part of it or relevant to it, is really important. Being clear with the decision makers, as part of the conversation, whose input would change, your decision, playing these what if scenarios, to make sure, because I think, to me, that's how you kind of distinguish and determine on a particular project when and how it's right to engage stakeholders, because it's a very different process. One of the things that we're talking about doing for the next phase is participatory modeling, where stakeholders are actually part of it, and it's a fair amount of time commitment, where they see how the models are set up, they provide input, they provide their firsthand knowledge. We are committing ourselves, as a project team, to incorporating, their feedback and moving it forward. That's very different than, if it wasn't a project where it was appropriate to make that commitment and to include that interaction in the modeling framework. We want to make sure that it was more of a public outreach or an outward facing at key points in the process to provide information. So really being clear on what the role of particularly stakeholders are and what the decision makers see as their role is, I think is crucial.
Well, thank you so much, Soupy. I think we're going to have to leave it there. Really want to thank, on behalf of Caitlin and myself, this second round of our collaborative science conversations. So Stuart, Aimee, Soupy, and George, thank you for giving us a tour of your places and your problems and how you're solving them. Nick, is there any closeout that you'd like to share with us, with the audience, as we swing to the top of the hour?
Sure, just a couple quick things as we wrap up. We'll post the recording to the website and the YouTube channel within a few days. Remaining questions and answers will be included in the slide deck and posted as soon as possible. So if you do have some final thoughts or something that occurs to you after the session wraps up, you can put it in the exit survey and we'll try to get it answered and included in that final wrap-up product. And as we mentioned during today's intro, this is an ongoing series, so we're already thinking ahead to the next session, which is planned for spring of 2023. And we hope you can join us then to hear more about what the development of a collaborative science project entails and what the co-production process means for the science and the products. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you to our speakers for lending us their voices, and thank you to Doug and Caitlin for moderating.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.